name is László Jakaborsos. I'm the director of the Penn World Voices Festival, which is just about to unfold, exactly tomorrow. This is a week long of events of literature, politics, around about human rights and freedom of expression and First Amendment rights. This is the world's only literary festivals which embraces human rights agenda, and we all at Penn are very proud of this. About the Invisible Symposium. The Invisible Symposium is an experiment. It's a crazy experiment. Let me tell you something about the historical background of it. I'm Hungarian. The Invisible Symposium, the first Invisible Symposium took place in 1947 in Hungary, right after the Second World War, when a group of Hungarian artists, mostly visual artists and philosophers, initiated this idea, which meant that they sent out 50 questions to their fellow artists, quite a few people they actually reached out to, and they asked them to send back their answers in a couple of manuscript pages. They then collected, those questions were about to scrutinize the relationship between art and politics. Then, after the Second World War, just before the Russians were descending upon Eastern Europe, these were absolutely crucial burning issues. What they did, they received the answers and they edited into a script, and they called it the Invisible Symposium, and they printed and published the script. When I was at university, I fell in love with this idea. It actually was a very substantial, very interesting and inspiring text. So when I started to work on this year's festival and sat down with our staff, we were thinking how we can actually discuss. We were making a list of the most burning, most intriguing issues of our time. And we ended up two subjects. One is bravery. This year's festival is dedicated to bravery. And the other is democracy. Where does democracy turn? What's happening with our democracy? Is there a future, or it's all done? So what we thought, that it would be really useful and timely to revisit this wonderful idea of the Invisible Symposium. So what we did, we sent out 12 questions to a bunch of intellectuals all around the world, and we received 15 answers. We asked them to answer in about 3 manuscript pages. When we received the essays, the small essays, we were really intrigued by the level and the involvement of the participants. Then the next phase followed. We approached Roger Conover. Roger, are you here? Of MIT Press. Roger. There we go. Hi. Roger did the biggest chunk of the job. Roger got all the manuscripts and started to edit it into a script as these people from Ai Weiwei to Cornell West would be in the same room. And he came back with a very lively, interesting script. Then the next phase came when we approached. First, I have to say, I changed the concept while we were working on the concept. First, we thought that we're going to hire actors and we're going to reenact the whole script. But then, all of a sudden, I just had this idea, what if we would approach young writers, editors, and bloggers, and adding yet another layer to this conversation. So it happened. We approached a fabulous cast, and they received the script and they started to rehearse with Judith Barnes directing the show. We spent a couple of evenings together rehearsing the text, and there we go. This is it. This is the experiment. This is the end of the experiment. We're going to publish the script on our website. This is a slightly edited version of the script, but a very interesting one. So let's the Invisible Symposium begin. One important thing I've forgotten, that Ai Weiwei tonight is going to be played by Hayden DeWitt. I'm sorry, Hayden.
and I am the only one who is actually visible at this event. And that is a very difficult position for me, because I am also playing a character very akin to myself, what I do. I've done a lot of panels. I have never done a panel with people who aren't there. The problem with doing a panel with people who aren't there is that you can't challenge them. When they make a wild, broad, counterfactual assertion, you can't ask them about it. You have to sit on your hands. And it reminds me a little bit of what happened in 1962 when Leonard Bernstein at Carnegie Hall was going to be doing a Brahms concerto with Glenn Gould, and he completely disagreed with his interpretation. And before the event started, he said, "I just want everybody to know that I have serious problems with this." And so I will ask you, as members of the audience, and also our readers here, to listen, and if there's something you want to address briefly, we don't want to do 2 hours, but if you can say it in less than a minute and you want to address an assertion made from this stage, we will offer that opportunity at the end. We offer it also to the readers here, who are sometimes saying things with which they may not entirely agree. For the most part, I will try and put a sock in it to the extent that that is possible for me, and it's a big challenge. So, let me begin, first of all, by pouring myself some wine. Sorry you guys don't get any, but this is a symposium. And begin with the question, what are the essential features of democracy? What does democracy mean to you?
Democracy is first and foremost a way of life or mode of being in the world. Like jazz, it requires us to candidly question ourselves, listen closely to others, and muster the courage to lift our voices in order to shape our collective destiny.
Democracy is a universal set of standards for dealing with governments, power, public involvement, individual freedom, and human rights.
It's the political system that makes human equality possible. There are as many democracies as there are democratic nations in the world, and they all share 2 basic elements: the separation of powers and the supremacy of election to appoint government.
But many dictators rose to power through elections. Winning an election does not mean democracy. In order to establish a democratic government, the party that gains power through free elections must comply with the framework of democracy. That framework is the principle of human rights.
Democracy is defined by 2 essential elements: equality before the law and the defense of individual rights against the state. Otherwise, there is no democracy.
But in fact, there are several kinds of democracy today. One Western with 2 different models, the Anglo-Saxon and the European, and one Eastern, grafted onto a system of restrictive traditional and religious values and structures, such as Japan, South Korea, India, Israel, Lebanon. Here, democracy is taken for granted. There, it is a compromise.
There's also a huge spectrum of imposter democracies. From those rigged elections where the dear leader always wins 99%, to democracies where the vote is free, but the election promises bear no resemblance to what politicians actually do once they're in office. For a democracy to be real, there must be a relationship between what people vote for and what they get. This is a simple concept, but it eludes virtually every state in the post-globalization era.
What about the United States, in which corporations have been deemed to be human beings? Is the US really a democracy at the present time? Democracy is supposed to mean government by the people, whomever they may be, not by kings or aristocracies or corporations.
I don't think a pure model of democracy exists anywhere. Unfortunately, corruption is the essence of any government. Even the best kinds of people are corrupted by power. Being Iranian, I see problems in the way that our government mixes religion and state in its idea of democracy and justice as informed by a distorted version of Islam. But even in America, there are fundamental problems. Margaret Atwood asked if the US is really a democracy. It's certainly not the democratic society it tries to be. It's a question of measures and degrees.
No, it's meaningless to talk about full and limited democracies. Either there are free elections or there aren't. The separation of powers either works or it doesn't. Either there is equality before the law or there isn't. While democracy may have some local color, it does not have different gradings or measures. Either there is democracy or there isn't.
Well, there is a reason we define certain things as universal rights or inalienable rights. You can debate the advantages of parliamentary system versus the presidential one. You can be baffled by the electoral college. But if it's a real democracy, it provides fair representation to the citizen.
But there is something no one has mentioned here. As an Israeli, I must say that the most ominous characteristic of all democracies is that they are made up of citizens and everyone else. This is usually not acknowledged, but no democracy overcomes it. The issue is, how do governed people who are non-citizens participate?
So we start talking about the ideal of democracy and we slide ineluctably into the problems and the failures of its implementation. So let's go there. We've heard the ideal. What about how it's implemented? Is it working? Leonidas Martin, is it healthy?
Democracy is a system of beliefs, like capitalism or any other political system. If we believe in it, it can be built, though not without conflicts. If we lose trust, it enters into a crisis. To build on such a delicate foundation is risky, because any idea that gains strength can open the way to toppling the system.
If the genius of democracy has managed to make it through all these thousands of years, it will certainly survive the next century.
Peter, get closer to your mic.
Pardon me. But when democracies do collapse, they'll surely be devoured from within. They are complicated, costly, and slow, at the mercy of self-serving interests, corrupt practices, and protectionism. And all this is played out in full view of the public. It is the only political system that finds pleasure in undermining its own credibility. And that is what makes it credible. Democracy must stick to the rule of law, but it has no neat solutions. It catches pickpockets and lets high-profile thieves walk away with billions.
I think that a lot of us take for granted the importance of democracy. I remember being terrified when I was detained in the airport in Iran because I was aware that I had no way of defending myself. There was no question of justice, no systematic regulations to come to my aid. Later, when I traveled back, I just became desperately grateful for the idea of democracy.
Today, there is no alternative form of government with sufficient legitimacy to supplant the democratic one. Where we disagree, it is about what should be understood as democracy and how it should be institutionalized. Despite efforts by the West to present its model as the only true and legitimate understanding of democracy, it is clear that Western liberal democracy is far from achieving any kind of global acceptance as the end of history.
In fact, to many people, democracy equals the West, equals supremacy of the wealthy. To others, democracy is an illusion, a heresy. The Islamic world rejects it.
Well, the ills of democracy are easy to see and to expose, while its virtues are subtle, long in scope, and open to eternal debate. This makes it all the more important to come to its defense at every opportunity.
If the Islamic world rejects democracy, and I will insert here as the visible brook that I find that an astonishing assertion, but if in fact democracy is not accepted globally, does that mean that this project, Boalem, cannot succeed?
Perhaps. As Peter Nadash commented, democracy has shown a formidable ability to adapt. It has withstood a great many crises already, such as recessions, wars, and secessions, to name just a few. But when crisis persists, that is when democracy is truly at greatest risk. That's when it can break down and give rise to monsters like Nazism, fascism, McCarthyism, Vichyism, Francoism, and so on. Putting democracy on hold in order to get through a time of crisis only puts democracy in crisis.
Hegel showed us that when we pursue something, it sometimes turns into its opposite. I believe something like that happened with democracy. If we take a look at the most recent wars, it's clear that almost all of them have been carried out in the name of democracy. But in these situations, democracy emerges as a kind of contemporary imperialism, a warlike organization in alliance with all these non-democratic countries that, coincidentally, are also the poorest. In the West, we want democracy. For us, it's synonymous with freedom, but we're willing to abolish these freedoms as we search for it.
We must have the courage to raise our voices and put our bodies on the line in the face of our tragic comic predicament. But we who live in democracies must also face the truth about our political existence. Big business and big banks are the monarchs of our time, and the poor are our slaves.
Yes. To the powerful, democracy has long ago ceased to make sense because it is quarrelsome, inefficient, and obstructive. But the secret of democracy lies in its very courage to obstruct. We all have to be that man in Tiananmen Square who blocked the tanks by refusing to move. The great temptation of the political class in the West is not to identify with that man, but with the tanks. The thinking being that the Chinese way is the efficient way. Well, it is efficient. The massacre in Tiananmen Square was the overture to the biggest economic boom in the recorded history. Workers have no rights and are ruthlessly exploited. Does that make the Chinese way the right way, even in a world that has growth as its all-dominant imperative?
A democracy is the least evil among all existing political systems. Power will always betray, and it can never fully represent the people. But at its best, democracy is a form of humanity that allows individuals to live and act collectively and to understand their personal responsibilities towards a society.
When Apollo 8 emerged from the dark side of the moon in 1968, and beamed back an image of our planet as we had never seen it before. That was a transcendent moment in the human race, forever changing the way we see ourselves. Suspended in darkness, our smallness against just the vast emptiness of the universe. Never had we had a clearer image of our vulnerability and the reality of our global community. Suddenly seeing ourselves without national, religious, cultural, and political borders, all of us belonging to a single fragile world, brought home the inescapable truth that the fate of each of us is dependent upon all. And this is the essential rationale for participatory democracy. It symbolizes the need to coexist in the world. The challenge for the democratic project is to achieve this by respecting the equality of all people and protecting fundamental human rights, especially of dignity, respect, and freedom.
Isn't that what it comes down to? That democracy is the only form of government that can fulfill the desire every human has for respect and dignity. It allows each citizen to say, I matter, I have a voice. Every other system eventually comes down to threats and bribery that attempt to suppress this basic desire for individual respect.
It does. And there was also an irony in that Apollo 8 image, that unified, tranquil, peaceful image. It came at a time of great upheaval across the world. The Cold War was intensifying. Feminism, the civil rights movement, and the decolonization movement fundamentally challenge the distribution of power. Equality still remains elusive, but so long as we believe in the principle that all people are equal, entitled to dignity and a sense of self-determination, the aspiration for democracy will continue to be not only relevant but critical.
There is no entity called democracy. It is just a term for a certain non-aristocratic form of government. Instead, why not ask every human being, am I my brother's keeper? And if so, is he mine? And how far are we going to take this?
Non-aristocratic? I have the impression that so-called democratic societies have been taken over by the apparatus of a moneyed aristocracy. This aristocracy has no liking for equality. Anytime there is a demand for hordes of silent slaves, migration gets underway. Then, the aristocracy promotes racism to defend its rule. European civilization should have learned from its own tradition of forced religious conversion, genocide, and human trafficking, but it missed the opportunity. And I would be surprised if it made the effort anytime soon.
Let's be frank here, right? We're talking about oligarchies, not democracies. These days, voting means replacing one brand of government with another brand within a very narrow range of choices. We're free to choose, but only if we choose what's on the menu. It's only when democracy is criticized that its limits are expanded. Democracy is ambiguous. And by that, I mean that in order for it to be real, it needs to be challenged.
There's no doubt that democracy must be constantly challenged. And not only challenged, but revised, adapted, reinforced. But who is going to do it, and how? And how can it be made universal? How do you democratize democracy? One thing is certain, democracy has to change because society changes, and there is a constant influx of new players with specific demands. Young people, homosexuals, the handicapped, immigrants, religious followers, the list goes on and on.
Democracy is only hardware with a basic framework. It requires programming from the people in order to respond to their needs. It is only effective when people apply the ideas of democracy to adapt their own society.
Apply democracy to their own society. What I've heard on the stage from people like Gary Kasparov and Ai Weiwei is a wholehearted, full-throated support of democracy, and from the writers on the stage and the artists who come from deeply flawed democracies, a sense that the project is almost fatally injured. But nevertheless, and a lot of that ambivalence came from Boalem, he still says that there's a need to spread it around the world. How exactly do we spread democracy? Do we have to allow each nation as it will to adapt it or not? What about exporting democracy? It has such a mixed history. Does this ever work, or do these attempts only serve to diminish what democracy is?
Democracy is not a commodity or merchandise that can simply be exported to one or another country. It is not an accident that can happen overnight. Democracy is a historical process. It must travel the course of its evolution.
But for the sake of the common good, democracy must be disseminated around the world. The right approach is to support indigenous democratic processes. Military intervention, when decreed by the UN, is legitimate if it's decreed to lend assistance to an endangered people or to restore overthrown constitutional order. To fail in this duty is to weaken global security, silencing conscience, and cutting the bonds of solidarity between states and populations.
Let me tell you, intervention follows a familiar pattern, from the Crusades to the most recent civilizing expedition. Catch the distant barbarians in some doltish act, offer them a better deal, and quietly cart off their raw materials and jewels. In the history of democratic intervention, I find only two exceptions to this rule: the defeat and reorganization of Nazi Germany and the war in Kosovo. All other interventions were nothing but disguised attempts at market capture.
Of course, I agree that forced regime change can never succeed. And democratic institutions built from the ruins of invasion are always going to be fragile. But on the other hand, revolutions from within have led to democracies. Even some of the hardest regimes have given way to the power of the people who have brought down walls previously considered indestructible. From the slow crumbling of the Iron Curtain to the Arab Spring of the past years, we've witnessed how dramatically and tenaciously people can alter the nature and style of governance.
But all democratic regimes since the 18th century have involved the exertion of violence and the exclusion of certain parts of the population. And in this sense, all democracies were instated from without. The constitution of the American regime, where blacks and women were constituted as non-citizens, is one example. The Israeli regime, which in 1948 expelled most of the local population from Palestine, is another. The fact that we do not tend to see these regimes as democracies introduced from outside can only be explained by the fact that we tend to identify the ruling group with the inside.
And when a country invades another country in the name of democracy, you have good reason to question the democratic nature of the invading state.
Yes, even if we accept the flawed premise that countries are invaded to bring them democracy, which is always just a cover story, it never works. By its nature, democracy must be a product of democracy, of a democratic upwelling from the majority, from below. Only then will the movements that demanded it have the courage to protect it from those who will inevitably try to hijack it.
The American people didn't invade in Iraq. It was the oil industry using its military wing, otherwise known as the U.S. Army. In Afghanistan, there isn't any oil. That's why we managed to maintain the illusion that we kill Afghans for altruistic reasons.
In a world of national governments dominated by transnational corporations and global oligarchies, I'm afraid the future of democracies looks pretty grim. Even effective regulation appears to be a pipe dream, given the levels of corruption and cronyism. In our day, democracy is a fugitive activity.
Not all transnational phenomena are a threat to the democratic project, but those that are certainly highlight the need to build international mechanisms through institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. As the recent global financial crisis has shown, when nations act in unison with other nations, this can be a backdrop for democracy to grow across regions and nations.
I completely disagree. The International Monetary Fund radically restricts the democratic space for national governments. Democracy without the ability to control economic forces is an illusion, a charade, a tease, a recipe for mass cynicism. People vote for politicians on the promise that it will change their material circumstances. But that promise is routinely broken, as politicians, once in office, claim that they are helpless in the face of mobile multinationals or that their hands are tied.
Democracy has to adapt. It has to adapt to the new legal and economic realities of globalization. The International Court of Justice has been proving how important it has become to track human rights violators, where local democracies have failed. But it has been impotent to confront global crime, particularly because the concept of global has no judicial validity, and crime is still conceived exclusively as perpetrated inside the borders of a nation.
Can you elaborate? Why do you think crime is such an important issue?
Without proper tools to prosecute international crime, worldwide terrorism can shield behind national borders. The case of bin Laden shows that in the absence of effective local tools, international justice is left to be secured by coup de force, prompted without legal frame. By the same token, there is no international institution with the power to confront illegal actions of global economic powers. We must strengthen international institutions in order to face powers that are bigger than nations.
Governments can join together to regulate the banks, as they should have done after the 2008 crash. They can collaborate to close tax havens. They can impose sanctions on any country that gets in the way. And they can band together to change the rules of trade agreements or opt out entirely.
But the problem is that these unions encourage a self-centered and sectarian outlook, an attitude of us against them, instead of building cooperation and solidarity. The European Union only takes the interests of Europeans to heart, isolating them inside an artificial framework. The Arab League has a racist view of political relations. The organization of the Islamic Conference divides the world into Muslims and non-Muslims. We must build a genuinely global institutions capable of bringing democracy to everyone and of putting a human face on globalization. Some measure of federalism is needed. The UN is inadequate.
Wherever there is democracy, nation states find themselves subordinate to economic powers. They're the agents. They carry out whatever these powers establish as real. The democratic states have become institutions dedicated to depoliticizing the societies they govern. For them, modernization means advancing alongside the capitalist movement. To oppose this logic means fighting against privatization, and that would imply questioning the unquestionable in a contemporary democratic society. Today, there is no democratic government willing to take on this job, despite the fact that the existing model, what we have now, excludes and kills more and more people.
Indeed, we make a big mistake when we confuse the concepts of free market with free democracy.
Look, national governments could bring individual and communities together if they wanted to, but they don't. And there is a special reason for this. Over the past 20 years, as anomalies piled high by the market economy ran amok, democracy's basic control mechanisms broke down. Under the pretense of sustainable growth, money markets generated piles of cash without any collateral in the real economy. 1/3 of the cash circulating around the globe is fictional, the results of computer simulation, a figment of the imagination. But creditors want real money, not fiction. National governments are then forced to convert virtual funds into hard cash. To do so, they take from the most vulnerable parts of their own population and the most helpless of the third world. And you know what? These governments are well aware that the maneuvers are actually destroying democracy itself.
The commodification, commercialization, and marketization of our governments, our cultures, even our relationships, means everything and everybody is up for sale.
I believe the question we were asked to address was whether democracy can continue to exist in view of powers acting upon it from within and without. I just wanted to add to Peter's doubts a doubt of my own. The question assumes democracy is a desirable but threatened form of government. For anyone following the ways in which protest movements are oppressed by democratic regimes, it is obvious that citizens threaten democratic regimes precisely because they've had enough of them and are seeking other forms of being together that upend the demarcations of inside and outside and of the world as an object of possession purchased in the name of capital and nation. The global protest movements today wish to think of other forms of sharing and partnership in the world.
But we can't give up on indigenous democratic processes when they emerge. It's still necessary to support people in oppressed countries who have not yet had enough of democracy to fight for their own experience of it.
And yet we do find that in nations that have had a long history of democracy, the rates of participation in voting have been in slow but steady decline. Chantal?
Yes, and this is clearly one of the reasons for the sense we have that we are now living in post-democracies. The state is seen as impotent before transnational corporations, and the parties appear totally unable to offer any real alternative to the dictates of the market forces.
Most voters already know that big business runs their countries, and this, no doubt, is a factor in declining participation rates.
And if most voters think that big business runs their country, who can blame them? They're right. When big business rules, it doesn't mean that it controls everything. It simply means that chaos rules. The power of big business is the power to sabotage every attempt to restrict that chaos. It doesn't have a new world to offer us. It can only destroy the old. Margaret Thatcher said famously that there was no such thing as society. When big business runs nations, there will be no such thing as society. As a matter of fact, there will be no such thing as a country. Does that mean that more and more people will abstain from voting? Well, in the United States, it will. In Europe, it will give rise to an increasingly powerful populist movement. So far, these have been mostly on the right, but one day they'll be on the left also. We'll either end up witnessing the burning down of the ethnic ghettos or the defenestration of the rich from the steel and glass skyscrapers of high finance. Unless the political center wakes up and realizes that it must stop obeying the dangerous imperatives of big business.
I actually think that the interests of the electorate and big business are one and the same. No surgeon's scalpel could cut one from the other. At best, voters pretend to have no truck with big business. However, it's useful to remember that when you ride the subway, turn on the lights, brush your teeth, switch on your computer, dispose of your selected garbage, watch the news, discuss the future of democracy with friends in a cafe or on a stage, eat vegetables, fish, or meat, and pay with a bank card. You serve big business and enjoy its blessings. You participate in the circulation of vested interests that you then criticize at will. What democratic governments do today is represent people who expect relentless economic growth resulting in ever-increasing wealth and happiness. Live better every day of every year without giving one fuck that all the resources needed for growth must be taken from someone else.
But come on, young voters are beginning to understand that if they want real democracy, they will have to seize it back from corporate elites. This was the spirit of Occupy Wall Street, as well as new political movements that target fossil fuel companies for their role in the climate crisis and their perversion of the political process. Today's activists aren't giving up on democracy, but they are increasingly taking the fight directly to those who are corrupting it.
And giving up the rightful vote is not an expression of losing interest in politics, but of contesting the validity of a political system that has proven, too slowly, unfortunately, to be a cynical exploitation of citizens for the sake of preserving a regime system of which they are not the cause.
When your understanding of democracy is that it's no more than just another way of doing business, you feel cut out. And that produces a great malaise. The forms this malaise adopts is varied. Xenophobia, nationalism, religious fundamentalism, a low electoral turnout as well. I mean, why should I vote if I'm a nobody here? But if there's one thing that recent social movements like Occupy and Los Indignados have shown us, it's that it is one thing to be excluded from democracy, as it works in contemporary societies, and another to be excluded from politics altogether. Today, democracy can be found in public streets and plazas, much more so than in institutions.
I actually was in one of those big demonstrations in Egypt. And one thing that I learned from the Arab Spring is that the people's power is quite amazing. I became, for the first time, a strong believer that change could only come if everyone, absolutely everyone, who believes what they believe in gets out. Nothing is more frightening to the authorities than sheer numbers of people. They cannot kill enough, they cannot arrest enough, they cannot censor enough. There's just nothing they can do. Then it becomes very contagious. That sense of hope is felt, that sense that it doesn't matter if I'm rich or poor, or if I'm educated or not, or if I'm young or old. If I'm just physically present in that community, I have power. And that is a very incredible awareness for people to have.
My feeling about great disparities in wealth tends toward the practical. When things get a little too disparate, along comes the French Revolution, and heads roll.
Let's talk about disparities. Margaret, could you pour me some red? Heads roll when the disparities get great. Democracy thrives, as many of you observed earlier, when there is dignity and equality under the law, and when people are treated as equals. So do we measure the strength, the vitality of a democracy by the treatment of those who are marginalized?
Oh, the role of the marginalized is critical. They are the miner's canary, the litmus test, where those comfortable within society, like many in this room perhaps, can see nothing wrong beyond their own experience. Those on the margins hold up a mirror in which society can see its true face.
Yeah, they're the living image of an ailing society, the ones who remind us daily that capitalism and democracy should not, cannot go hand in hand, and that it's urgent to separate the two. A handful of elites have access to power, and the majority are totally barred, while the social group that doesn't fit into the democratic system is getting larger and larger, and the fence separating us from them is getting smaller and smaller.
It's not just the less favored, but the general populace that is increasingly shut out of the democratic game. We have to fight harder than ever to win even the most modest favor from democracy. Immigrants and the poor don't exist. They are neither represented nor defended. On the contrary, they are blamed for all evils. They are expelled. They are pushed into ghettos, devastated by unemployment, delinquency, crime, and religious extremism. Alienation, if it endures, benefits extremism. In the Arab nations, it has served the Islamists well.
The immigrant in particular is the scapegoat of democracies. The more we verbally abuse him or her, the more democratic we prove ourselves to be, since limitless freedom of expression is supposedly the true symbol of a democracy. This gives us the right to verbally abuse one another. The weak are always the easiest to abuse. Recent or unassimilated immigrants are of special importance to the indigenous poor, since they give them someone to look down upon. They are also of special importance to demagogues, since they give them someone to target.
But let me remind you that freedom of speech is not boundless and limitless under the law. According to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the boundary for freedom of speech gets drawn at voicing provocation for war and inciting hatred based on religion, race, or ethnicity.
Be that as it may, I speak here from my own experience as a Danish citizen. For 10 years in Denmark, we heard nothing but the verbal abuse of immigrants, and the only response from the intelligentsia was to insist on the rights of the abusers in the name of freedom of speech. Of course, the opposite should be the case in an ideal democracy, but an ideal democracy is nowhere to be found. It is the very nature of democracy that it cannot exist in its pure state. It would then become a utopia, and utopias are always totalitarian.
Naomi, just a second. I have to say that is the most twisted tautology I have ever heard, Karsten, and I love listening to you, but sheesh. Please proceed.
Well, right now, immigrants and the poor serve mostly as props and foils in democracy. They're used to try to lure middle-class voters to one party or another and to divert public rage from being directed at the top of the economic ladder where it belongs. In the US, meanwhile, elaborate schemes are contrived to prevent the truly excluded from voting. What exists in this country, in the same way that democracy that excluded blacks and women was not a democracy. However, if our democracies were more robust and mechanisms were in place to truly enfranchise all potential voters, these constituencies could change the face of politics entirely.
Wait. Democracy owes us a voice, and nothing but a voice. It's up to the people to use that voice, and to use it wisely. Even racists deserve a voice, if only to remind the majority that they cannot sleep at night.
I agree that it is of the utmost importance for every citizen to have a voice and a vote. But Should the citizen be allowed to decide whether he wants to participate in civic matters, or should he be made to get involved? My opinion is that participation should be obligatory in order to prevent democracy from stagnating and from remaining the prerogative of the privileged.
I agree. Voting should be mandatory, like it is in Argentina, Australia, Belgium, and elsewhere, where everyone must vote on pain of penalty.
I think that the pain of penalty in places like, for instance, Australia, is simply an expectation of civic duty. I think the fine there, the pain is maybe $20 or something like that, but it is an expectation. However, even if you impose an expectation, is that a form of coercion? And if you coerce people to vote, which is a form of expression, can you then allow yourself willy-nilly to impose on other forms of expression as well, like hate speech, in order to preserve the strength of a democracy? So my question is, how far can you go, and what's the role of the media in this?
Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, weighed in on free speech in the 1st century AD. "It is not deeds that make men tremble," he wrote, "but rather the words about the deeds." 2,000 years later, democracy finds itself permanently exposed still to a war of definitions. And the battlefield where this war is being waged is the media, the mass media. Whoever makes the best case for the meaning of something will be declared the victor. And that's why the problems of democracy are related to the problems of representation.
Let me continue the Greek theme by mentioning the word parrhesia. It implies not only freedom of speech, but the obligation to speak the truth, no matter how unpopular. Plain, frank, fearless, unintimidated speech, that is parrhesia. It is a benchmark of any democracy. Even the most profound critic of democracy, Plato himself, says so in the Republic, because his mentor, Socrates, exemplified and enacted parrhesia, which led to his death.
You see, democracy is not a dusty old Greek theory. It is a practice. The ancient Greeks knew that free expression was vital to their democracy and that the entire system is destroyed when expression is curtailed. Today, the media is the amplified voice of the people. And by the way, media barons are people too. They just want to make money, a most populist pursuit. When media freedom is infringed, it means the freedom of expression is infringed. When the government tries to expand or preserve its authority by taking an active role in deciding what is and is not acceptable speech, this inevitably leads to more abuses.
Media is the oxygen of democracy. Without objective information, people cannot vote responsibly. They are manipulated, and democracy becomes a facade.
Yes, but the danger here is that a dysfunctional media is just a poisonous enemy of a fair and free democracy.
Media, at its best, digs out the truth and holds power accountable. At its worst, it's yellow journalism, phone hacking, libel, and stupid hoaxes involving the royal family and resulting in the suicide of nurses. Unfortunately, one sometimes has to put up with the worst to make room for the best.
Well, the problem of the media is currently a very important one because almost everywhere it is controlled by big corporations with enormous economic power. To speak of the freedom of the press under those conditions is total hypocrisy. To accept that a single group could control several newspapers and TV channels, as is the case in many countries, is totally unacceptable in a democratic society. It is therefore urgent that new legislation is established to impede such a concentration of power in the domain of the media.
Media decentralization is as important as media freedom. We need a variety of voices, viewpoints, and visions with wide accessibility to citizens and people. Media centralization is a handmaiden to elite rule.
The media system is pretty rotten the world over. And freedom of expression is losing ground everywhere. In democratic countries, it is the tyranny of the politically correct, of groupthink, of conformity that has taken over. Public debate shuts down, taboos multiply. Islam becomes untouchable, and the slightest critique unleashes worldwide fury, sparked by the self-proclaimed guardians of Islam, such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan. The fear of being accused of Islamophobia, of racism, of anti-Semitism, of homophobia leads to paralysis. The cautionary principle turns into fear of expression. Democracy has let itself be colonized by the ideas of tyranny and regression. It must be freed and cleansed of such thoughts. It is a global challenge. The slide to the lowest common denominator is already happening apace.
And including in elections, they are now just a show where politicians have been reduced to entertainers whose capacity for appearing attractive in the media are much more important than the actual ideas which they articulate. Moreover, the crucial role played by money has made them dependent on lobbies that try to impose the priorities of interest groups against the search for the public interest. The public sphere has become privatized, and it has ceased to provide an arena where the citizens are able to take part in a vibrant debate.
The media are not interested in legitimate debate except when it is presented as opinions clashing with other opinions. Debates in media are always dogfights intended to draw blood. They are not there to enlighten, but to entertain. Do we need these carefully staged gladiator fights in order for freedom to flower? Do we?
I'm sorry, I just have to say something, even though it's not in the script, which is that so much of this discussion involves what's happening now, as if these trends in the media haven't been forever with us, that are, as Gary said, driven by the desire to make money. And who is spending that money? As Peter Nadish said, we get the government that we deserve. We get the media that we deserve. And I'll stop there.
This entire issue of the media and free speech profoundly affects individual life and thought. In Iran, you can't even imagine expressing yourself without self-censoring. You start by assuming the absence of freedom of expression, and as a consequence, you learn to be very poetic, symbolic, and metaphoric in terms of how you express yourself. As an artist, my language and my aesthetic is automatically coded so that the government cannot detect any sharp knives beneath the surface. Western artists like to see how far they can push free speech, for example, by insulting religion, and they usually get away with it. But ironically enough, operating without freedom of expression has actually empowered artists because they have to be so inventive and savvy to find ways to threaten the government. As for the media, they play a great role in keeping the public ignorant and misinformed. Actually, I think in this country, it happens as much as in Iran, though in a different way. In America, it's all about marketing, money, and brainwashing people. That the media is so vividly shallow is one of the most unfortunate parts of American culture. In Europe, the media is much more intelligent. The importance of media in shaping American identity and Americans' dependence on it is frightening. Sorry to say, but a lot of stupid people are becoming even more stupid because of the media. In contrast, everyone who is Iranian knows that the media is completely controlled, that it's all one-sided and it's a complete lie.
Sometimes I think we need freedom not of, but from the mass media. Alternative channels of communication that are neither enthralled to political powers nor to advertisers. Sometimes we need just to talk to each other.
Here's a little piece of advice on how to get freedom from the mass media? Turn it off. Don't buy it. Don't listen. Don't watch cable TV. It works because people like it. Cable TV, the 24-hour electronic fireplace, engenders an environment where we want them to flood the zone. We want to tune into continuous coverage. We want to watch a car chase with a single rivulet of drool coming down the side of our mouth while we're eating popcorn. This is how we consume. Does this make us more stupid than the Europeans? I don't think so. The difference is, in Europe, many of the papers are already associated with particular political perspectives. And so perhaps a greater degree of skepticism is brought to the media. And I wouldn't disagree with that. Back in the days of the penny press, when we had 10 newspapers in New York City, people would buy half a dozen of them a day, and they knew they wouldn't believe everything they read. So perhaps we have to sharpen those tools. But it's us who have to change, not the media. That said, we are in a unique time and place when we can communicate one-to-many on the internet with social media. Can't these new tools offer us new ways to organize and participate in democracy?
I have to say something to this. The development of new technologies and the internet is like the arrival of angels to fight against evil. Though China is still an authoritarian society, microblogging sites such as Sina Weibo are allowing basic exchanges of information and discussions. Popular access to such social media is slowly opening narrow gaps and spaces to push the idea of democracy, even when strict censorship remains in place. There is still no space in the Chinese society for the real practice of democracy or media freedom. No one has ever seen an election ballot, and no one has ever been asked for his or her political opinion. However, internet technology is offering a glimmer of hope and accelerating towards an early form of democracy. Maybe the real fight has just begun.
The Arab Spring and the Green Movement were Facebook revolutions. Had it not been for the latest developments in networking and passing information instantaneously, not so many people would have been mobilized and informed. The creation of this virtual Facebook community is an undeniably positive thing. I was suddenly having conversations with 10,000 people in Iran who previously felt that I was inaccessible, and from whom I too felt cut off because I don't travel to Iran. Suddenly, it didn't matter where you lived, how old you were, if you were rich or poor, even what your religion was. The point was that we all wanted change and democracy.
When it comes to the internet, the medium is not necessarily the message. The fact that the net is available to everybody does not automatically make it democratic. The net is just a tool, and as a tool it can be used by everybody, the fundamentalists, as well as the libertarians, the Puritans, as well as the pornographers. We told ourselves that the Arab Spring was a Twitter revolution, but now we know that the mosque was stronger than the net. The Arab world is experimenting with new forms of democracy. They most definitely will be imperfect, as democracy always is, and we might not like them.
The internet and social media have certainly created a multitude of new spaces for participation in democratic debate, as well as new forms of organizing. But when it comes to making democratic decisions together, the promise of digital democracy has proved a disappointment. If anything, we are moving in the other direction. A new generation of political actors who are part of new movements from Cairo to Quebec are craving a far more physical, tangible form of democracy than they get at the ballot boxes, let alone on their computer screens. We are seeing a resurgence of popular assemblies, of participatory democracy, as well as movements for workplace democracy. Face-to-face deliberation and debate are the wave of the future, not more clicktivism.
Maybe you have put your finger on the biggest problem. the difficulty of reconciling democracy and globalization, which are, in fact, two opposing and antagonistic paradigms. Democracy puts into play human relationships, which evolve slowly and randomly, whereas globalization connects information networks, markets, and corporations, in which man is a variable quantity. This disconnect gives rise to a new player, an intermediary between humans and the marketplace, whose democratic role is not that clear. That is, the expert, to whom the media, governments, political parties, and citizens are constantly turning in order to make sense of the world. It is this disconnect that will be responsible for creating the world government of tomorrow, an invisible oligarchy of experts and technocrats.
Really? I would think that with the new technology available, we should be moving more towards direct individual participation, reducing the importance of the political middleman. Proxies may be necessary evils for efficiency's sake, but giving full control to people who so often fail to represent the interests of their constituents is no longer necessary in the internet age. Instantaneous representation is already here, but it's mostly limited at present to Facebook likes or online petitions, which squanders its political power.
I think it is a very dangerous illusion to believe that the internet could create the conditions for a new type of direct participatory democracy. Instead of helping people to become aware of other views and of engaging in productive exchange with people with different conceptions, the internet is often used as a way for people just to reinforce their current beliefs. Unlike the traditional media, through which people were necessarily exposed to a diversity of points of view, the internet allows people to avoid this kind of confrontation.
Well, on the other hand, though, these same developments have made people more interested in finding alternative ways to communicate and engage with ideas. But I do have to put a caveat on this use of social media. We have to ensure that the anonymity that festers hate, misogyny, and just a poisonous lack of civility doesn't damage the benefits that new media offers to participatory democracy.
Even though I don't approve of internet activists hiding behind the mask of anonymity, I increasingly understand it. They are not always on the right side of the law, but they are always on the right side of democracy. And these two things, being on the wrong side of the law and on the right side of democracy, are not always incompatible, especially in times of turbulence and crisis such as these. We don't want to live in a society given over to anarchy, but sometimes we need that anarchic impulse to change the world for the better.
So let's talk a little bit about that, perhaps moving on the wrong side of the law to change things for the better. That is to say, civil disobedience, consciously breaking the law in order to draw attention to a failure in democracy. These are days when there are incredibly sharp tools being developed. It's in the post 9/11 world, enabled us to track down perhaps the Boston bomber a lot faster than we might otherwise have. But, of course, we also had a lot of wrong people fingered for that because of the same tools held by amateurs. But the question is that surveillance is there. Surveillance is in the hands of authorities who have vast amount of information. And Gary, do you think, having come from or having grown up in a society famous for its surveillance, that this would put a crimp on democracy?
Brooke, the challenge is not so much about invasion of privacy by democratic governments. That will routinely increase as technology makes it easier, because it is the nature of every institution to collect as much information as it can, for better or for worse. The more important thing is who watches the watchers. If people know what is being collected and by whom and for what reason, an informed populace can have informed responses and challenge the administration. The danger is when public and private agencies are allowed to keep everyone in the dark, because then the information is almost inevitably used for darker purposes than originally intended.
On the other hand, with social media platforms such as Twitter, Individuals and groups have more possibilities than ever to organize themselves and exercise their rights. Broad participation and involvement will strengthen the power of individuals and provide unprecedented opportunities to voice opinions against the system.
In the past few months, I've been thinking that I should exercise my right to civil disobedience. A few weeks ago, I went as far as my bookshelf to look up what Thoreau had to say on the subject, only to decide that I would fail if I followed his advice today. The machine of the state would roll over me without any effort at all. Yet, I cannot give myself better advice than to seek out the antique forms of resistance, discussions in the evening, grassroots organizations, and mass rallies.
Unfortunately, these days, the use of painful crowd control tactics like tasers, pepper spray, and water cannons are being used to terrorize a promising new generation of activists who represent our best hope of building better democracies in the future. Violent police repression of peaceful social movements is one of the most serious threats we face to the promise of democracy.
Don't you think the greatest threat to democracy is climate change? It doesn't take long after the lights go out before the food hoarding and the mob rules start.
Oh, Margaret, bringing up climate change, we only have a minute to go.
Well, can anyone explain why there are no mass movements of young people protesting against the reckless irresponsibility of older generations that have not only contributed to global warming, but continue to ignore it despite the mounting evidence that it is the biggest problem ever faced by humankind? It is the future of the young, our children and their children, that is at stake. So why does nobody yell stop in a voice so loud that it cannot be ignored? Where are the clenched fists? Where's the indignation, the rage against this threat to civilization? Why is no one attacking the command centers of this ongoing destruction?
Opposition doesn't happen only in the form of physical demonstrations. A lot can be done off the streets. Protest only works at a certain stage in the development of events. It's not always a relevant step of opposition. People think that the Arab Spring and the Green Movement have finished because of the lack of protest. But in Egypt, people are saying, enough of going to Tahrir Square. Let's develop organizations that have really strong, long-term infrastructure and that are not just reactive.
And in my view, the possibility of expressing dissensus through legitimate organizations is the central condition for a good functioning of democracy. Otherwise, protests will take up violent forms.
In Russia, which is far from a functioning democracy, mass protest is the only nonviolent recourse. I sympathize with the concept of protest by violating unjust laws. This is a method of opposition I have championed in Russia since 2005.
In Iran, protest doesn't work today because the government has sabotaged the movement by really going after the protesters. They arrested, they tortured, they raped, they killed, they committed every atrocity to stop people from even thinking about demonstrating. And now, when we ask people, is there anything going on underground? They say, of course there is. It's all very hidden, but the genie is out of the bottle.
The great challenge that protest faces today, in my view, is how to survive long enough for its various expressions and formations to be institutionalized as the language of the shared world out of which a new regime might be conceptualized.
And how do we envisage a multipolar world with a plurality of democratic models and a variety of economic systems? A world order that would be a pluriverse, not a universe.
It's simple. We must keep shaping the imaginary until it becomes reality.
That's simple.
The biggest challenge facing the democratic tradition is to not give up, not cave in, not sell your soul in the global rule of big money. For the deep Democrat, it is a privilege to die for precious, struggling, and suffering people.
The ideal of democracy is a lot like the ideal of love. We all have our idealized version of it, and it inevitably falls short.
We also have all of our own definitions of it. What is its principal feature and its principal failure in the real world? This Invisible Symposium will now shift to the visible. We have people on the stage who have thoughts about what they've read, and I hope we have some people out there, you guys, who may want to remark on what you just heard. We can take a few minutes now to see if we can make the invisible visible and have some real exchange. Does anyone want to start out there, or should we start up here? Anybody up here have a thought?
Okay, well, I wanted to respond to what you said about the media, because it was a moment where I did not want to be shot anymore for a second, because you said that the way to resist the media is simply to, not turn on the television and to just not avail of it. I definitely
Actually, it wasn't
disagree.
resisting the media. It was, how do we escape from it, was the response. Resistance is actually something quite different. Also, say your real name so people know who you are.
My real name is Rafia Zakaria, and but I think that there's a problem in that attitude of saying that we're going to escape, then to demand something that's different.
I think that both apply. I think I know where you're going, and I completely agree with you.
Right, because what happens then is that the media becomes a reflection of sort of a tyranny of the majority, where you've got views that are held by a good chunk of the population that are endlessly regurgitated on television. And I'll give you a specific example. I'm Pakistani American. I've been watching the coverage of the Boston bombings, and it's very alienating and very despicable, because there's a complete lack of questioning of the premises of how much reaction is appropriate. This sort of collusion in the belief that we're going to consider this a political crime, that it cannot be compared to other law enforcement issues because it was committed by someone who's Muslim. And I don't see any challenging of that except in very, very limited circles. But I guess, the majority supports that view. So does that mean that we endlessly have to accept that perspective?
I've been following the coverage pretty closely. I don't know that I entirely agree with your characterization of it. I do think cable television has definitely taken that view. I also know that cable television is actually viewed by not very many people. It has a disproportionate influence in the corridors of power, and I've never quite understood why. It is true, certainly, that there is a kind of frame that is an American frame that I think at times is kind of despicable. I wouldn't disagree with that. When I spoke at the beginning, several times over the last decade, to people who report for Al Jazeera and created that network, they all said, we have a frame. That doesn't mean we're lying or we're not telling the truth, but we have a frame too. And how dare anybody suggest that a frame to reach out to the audiences that we're reaching out to is something inappropriate. I also think that there have been dissenting views from that, and mostly they've been following the FBI remarks there. But your larger point that there should be protest against bad reporting and biased reporting and just and bad frames too, if people can get that meta, is fantastic. And I certainly wouldn't say that's hopeless. Actually, I think more than ever people can have an impact, because now there is much more two-way communication than there ever was before. So to that degree, Rafi, I completely agree with you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Lucas Verbka. I'd like to stretch your point actually to a point made earlier by Gary. in which you were saying that the first step towards a new political world is to realize our own part in the problems with it now. I think taken basically that ignores the basic distribution of power in our society. We may be complicit in the system, but we do not shape it. If I turn off my television, if my entire town turns off my television, it's not going to change what's shown on that television if media conglomerates still have entire departments devoted to shaping that. That was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I think that's exactly right. And I think actually the logic, I think there's even a deeper problem in the question of majoritarian versus minoritarian when it comes to TV coverage or media coverage. The logic that says the media we have is the media that we want is the same logic that says the unemployed just don't want to work hard
It
enough.
is not the same logic.
It's
Not in any
close.
way. Not in any way.
And what I think it stems from, and I don't want to attribute this
There's
to Brooke,
consumption. Media is a consumer product.
What I would suggest is that the thought process behind both of those thoughts is actually one that most of us probably share on some level, and it's very compelling, which is a commitment to voluntarism. And that's actually a commitment that you've seen, I think most of the people who contributed thoughts to this panel really do believe. And that's why the emphasis on a kind of, I don't want to be too critical, but a kind of romantic call for street protest is sort of the summum of the political imagination that we've heard on this panel. You know, if you're unhappy about something, will you just go out and say something about it? Yell stop, as Karsten said. I mean, I would want to link actually a lot of these sort of commitments together, which is just this sort of very deep sentimental commitment that resides very deeply in the Western liberal imagination that thinks that there is no such thing as structure, there is no such thing as distributions of power that require massive amounts of organization and coercion to dislodge. And so I would just sort of suggest that there is a fascinating thread running through a lot of these comments where there's this desire for just only if individuals did something differently, there would be change, and I do think that's naive upon historical reflection.
And that is Jeremy K. Kessler. You should introduce yourself when you speak.
Jeremy K. Kessler.
Emily Crockett is my name. So, you know, there's a distinction between individuals doing something and a whole lot of individuals doing something, and, you know, Shireen made that point. But, you know, going back to what Brooke was saying, the media we get is not the media that we ask for. The media that we get is the media that we will accept, and the media that then we will continue to be given. And so it's, you know, what I think, the idea of oligarchy I found to be a really interesting thread in this piece, because you have two kinds of oligarchies. You have the one that's sort of explicit, where it's like the money and power is concentrated in these industries. And then you have the one that's kind of influence-based, that's like the wonks, essentially. Somebody talked about the experts being the intermediaries. And so, you know, with the media, there is definitely that oligarchy, and it's you know, with that corporate culture of media, there is, it's a culture with its own assumptions. They don't think, nobody ever thought they were the bad guy. And that includes the corporate barons. You know, even what it was Gary's line, like, you know, even media barons are people. They're, you know, so they're all acting in a certain interest and with certain assumptions. And so the question is how to challenge those assumptions on a mass scale so that it becomes social pressure. I believe is one of the most powerful forces on the planet for political change, for any kind of change.
I think financial pressure even more so, and although these criticisms of the media have been very much in place for a very long time, and Ben Bagdiki has challenged them, the fact is that those business models, those corporations are breaking down. I mean, we see it before our eyes. And so, you know, it is the television is still making some money, but less and less. We know it's happened to newspapers.
Oh, yeah, but do you realize how much of America still watches TV?
But it is, the trend is moving, and we can't ignore that trend. I'm so sorry. And I know Karsten did you want to remark to this, and then we will go directly to you?
No,
Karsten, or do you want to wait? Okay.
Well, I just wanted to continue the overall theme of the media repression that you keep talking about, but I wanted to know if any of the panelists would want to talk about the media repression of what's going on in Guantanamo. For example, a playwright that I know, Karen Malpede, I don't know how many people have heard of Karen Malpede. She wrote a play based on the testimony of a couple of people from being held, detainees at Guantanamo. The play did not receive very much media, not only didn't it receive media coverage, but there was a certain repression, she claims, in terms of the play being covered, particularly from the New York Times. And I wondered if any of the people on stage would want to speak about media repression at Guantanamo.
I can speak about that. I went to Guantanamo in 2006 on a media tour, and it was one of the most, I see the language. I was just reading an article in the Washington Post about hunger strikers, but when I was in Guantanamo, they were like, we try not, I don't know if they said this, but it was very clear that they didn't want to use the word hunger striker. They were fasting. And that, it was constant, like somebody who banged his head against the wall or tried to cut himself. It was manipulative, self-injurious behavior. And, people that were wrongly imprisoned and sent home were not, they were called no longer enemy combatants, which one judge was like, that begs the question of if they ever were enemy combatants.
And journalists are free to resist that framing.
They're free, but they don't, and it's really an effective, and it's just crazy that so many years have passed. I was there in 2006, and, there were hunger strikers, and we went, and there was a doctor, and he was like, well, they tell the nurse which nostril they want their feeding tube to go in. They're smiling when we put the tubes down, and that this is still happening years and years later. And I do think I felt complicit because I was on this dog and pony show as a member of the media, but also because it was.
But you wrote about what you saw, presumably.
I wrote about what I saw, but most of the people that were there to try to get a scoop. So they were with.
So they didn't write about what they saw.
They weren't presenting it. They weren't presenting the presentation. They were presenting.
And that needs to be connected to the democracy discussion we're having here. Because one big reason those people are in Guantanamo is because Congress, which is the elected representatives of the United States, has made it impossible for them to be moved to prisons on the U.S. mainland. So, I think that it's really crucial to draw those connections, because that's precisely what I'm saying, is that the American voters, and I would put the media as responsible in that equation, are unaware of the consequences of their electoral choices. Or if they're unaware, they don't think it's important enough for them to make different electoral choices based on what their representatives are doing in their name.
It's the issue of comfort, right? Like, if you are sufficiently comfortable in your life, and your empathetic imagination can only reach so far sometimes, and if you're sort of dimly aware that there's suffering going on, and yes, it's bad conceptually, but you don't feel it in your gut. And when, like, the FAA issue recently, the sequester is making children go hungry, but oh God, if you rich people miss their flight, and Congress jumps to its feet. And
it's pretty
so
embarrassing.
It's just that.
Karsten, then you, and then we'll have to end it. But we'll start. I know you're not Karsten. Say your real name.
I'm not Karsten. My name is Vaneshwaran. It's in the program. You can read the program.
Just say it anyway.
No, I just want to make my point quickly. What Emily is saying, it speaks to what Jeremy was saying earlier, and what I want to say is that this individual democracy is important. It's not simply a naive. This is how we change the country, in my country in South Africa, through these, fashioning oneself on these naive ideals, right? So, but what it means is, so what is
violence and terrorism in South Africa too?
Sorry?
There was a good deal of violence and terrorism in South Africa too that precipitated political change.
Sure, but I mean, it did. But what needed to happen? What makes somebody ready to change en masse, and the required participation and solidarity, which hasn't been mentioned once, the idea of solidarity. It first requires a personal democracy, a democratization, and that's a very, very subtle but important thing. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you.
I recently read Adam Thirlwell's book about the Arab Spring, and I was just wondering what you all are reading, and if you have any recommended fiction reads that have to do with the birth of democracy.
Fiction reads.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be fiction.
There was an interesting book that I read, which is emphatically not, although I wish there were. It may be a little fast for Arab Spring fiction, actually. You probably have to wait another 6 months or so, maybe.
Some democracies have been birthed before that one, though.
Andy Carvin, who is NPR's major Twitterer, talked about how he tweeted those revolutions and how he got drawn into it, and how Twitter can be used as an information tool, and how it should be regarded, and how the information on there should be handled. He tells some amazing stories about individuals which create wonderful narratives. So it's not just a technical book about Twitter. It actually is a story of how to follow something from very far away. I just read that and I thought it was good. I'm sure there must be some things closer to the actual event. I just can't recommend it.
For fiction, there's a really amazing Czech writer called Patrick Orednik, and he has a book called Europeana, and actually both of his 2 fiction novels are really about, that's a strong recommendation for me. I think he's kind of amazing. But it's interesting that you bring up the whole idea of fiction, because in many ways one of the motivating sort of myths of pen and why we're all here is this idea of the great writer, right? This is like the, a meeting of the most important minds, talking about democracy, which is inherently elitist, oligarchic, etc. And, the novel, this idea of, you can trace it the last 200 years, it's this protagonist of the eye, the Bildungsroman, and it's a very much a kind of a selfish form of telling and of seeing the world and expressing the unique individuality, which is very much in tension with what we refer to as these democratic ideals.
Mohsin Ahmed's The Reluctant Fundamentalist.
Oh, that is wonderful.
Just been made into a very good film, which I think
fantastic.
surpasses the book in
Mira Nair. Did you see it?
Yeah, watch that before you watch Iron Man 3. Maybe.
And actually, the main actor in there was also in the, this hilarious British film about, anyway, never mind. Sorry, go ahead.
I want to thank you all and Judith for amassing and compiling this amazing, overwhelming amount of intelligent discourse from such a variety of people. It's a little bit, so thank you so much, number one.
We don't get the credit for that part of it.
Well, we're here tonight, so all of us. It's a little emblematic, too, what's happening of the problem. There's too many fish on the beach after a flood, and when the raccoon comes up in the morning, he doesn't really know what to do, and he kind of he walks away. Yeah, well, the business about I'm at a certain age, and I've been through a lot of stuff, familial, personal, and political, for a long time now, where I'm overwhelmed. I think a lot of the public is, the information. And why are the kids...
Are you saying we're dead fish up here? Sorry.
No, baby. You're a lot of intelligent amassing of information and personality. Why the kids aren't out in the streets anarchically, or anyone else, and just talking to each other instead of clickism, which is also very important and good, is because, and the media, all these great things have been said, but so much has been covered, is because of distraction. There's too much. So you've got to find that place to focus. Charlie Rose, one of the things I watch, one of the things I get distracted by. I don't watch any other TV except sort of informational talk shows. One of these neurological programs said the brain is organized and evolved to filter things out. I had never heard that before. So it's a hard thing to do. And it's when you're raising kids in this day and age or anything else, it's crucial It's so crucial. So all you can do about the media or these is maybe, I love what you said, and I do some of that work publicly about, throwing a computer on the floor or dropping a smartphone in the toilet, or even the old radio I have, the AM radio in the kitchen. You can't really tune out, but you can limit it and filter it, and you can write those people quickly and just say, whenever I hear your station do this sort of sensationalist thing, I just turn. Just talking the way we are tonight, let it out, just put it out there like we did tonight. But you can at least write those sources, one little thing, when I hear that from you, because you've got to do something. We're preaching to the choir a bit. I was at Karen Malpede's symposiums, coincidentally, up at John Jay College. Small turnout as well, good work and good people. But anyway, thank you. But yeah, keep putting it out.
Thank you guys. You hung in there.